what's released by the IADC is a consensus view on what best practice looks like in terms of debris mitigation. Now, those guidelines, so the IADC Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, have been folded into national regulatory frameworks.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Aerospace Corporation. Today's show is number 3 in our 6-part series about space safety through a global lens. And we're going to be talking about international cooperation on operational safety. That's code language for space debris in this case. So tracking to prevent collisions, removing actively, deorbiting in a timely fashion, all of this plays a role. We're also going to hear about the United Kingdom's Space Agency from our guest, Andrew Ratcliffe, Chief Engineer of UKSA. And Andy, you also lead the UK delegation to UN COPUOS. That's the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the Science and Technology Subcommittee, correct?
Yes, that's me. Thanks for having me today.
And also the head of the delegation, the UK delegation to IADC, right? The Internet Agency Space Debris Coordination Committee.
That's right.
Well, thank you for joining today. I'm excited about talking.
No, thanks very much for having me.
So I'm going to just start off broad. I really want to talk about IADC, this interagency or intergovernmental kind of committee. So for people who haven't heard about it before, can you just introduce us to IADC?
Yeah, absolutely. So the IADC, the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, was actually formed just over 30 years ago. So originally it had 4 partners, 4 member organizations, and has now grown to 13 member organizations. So these are largely space agencies, that are global space agencies, that all come together and are performing research on space debris topics. Now, the key output of the IADC that some of your viewers might be aware of are things like the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, and there are a series of best practice around operations and debris mitigation. But critically, these are developed on the back of active research that's performed by the committee. So the committee itself has 5 major groups. So it has the steering group, which I sit on, and directs the work of the IADC. And then it has 4 working groups, and these are across measurements. So the techniques that we use to measure space debris on orbit, whether that's optical or radar. A working group looking at modeling, so how do we model and characterize debris objects on orbit, both natural and human-made. We have a working group on protection, so the shielding that we use on spacecraft to protect our spacecraft on orbit. And then another one on mitigation, so on the standards and guidelines of best practice that are established to guide how we operate.
So yeah, you talked about the mitigation guidelines, but yet mitigation is just one of the working groups. So what are kind of the outputs of does the committee in the measurement working group, do they measure success in terms of if things are going in the right, if we're moving the needle the right way?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the 4 working groups very much work together. So a lot of the work that's done by the IADC is across the working groups. So the working groups will work together on certain products. So, for example, on that specific point that you mentioned in terms of how do we measure success. So annually now we're releasing what we call the Status on the Space Debris Environment report. And that is released each year's UN COPUOS Science and Technical Subcommittee, which is usually in sort of the January to February timeframe. And that's looking both at the current status of the environment, so how well are operators meeting the current guidelines, but then also looking forward in terms of forecasting the future environment. So we're really trying to unite some of those pieces of work between the working groups.
Yeah, and the research aspect of what IADC does seems to be key to all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the key things around the IADC is it is seen as a core technical body. So across the international landscape, it has a unique role, essentially, being this set of global space agencies that bring together experts that are actively doing research in space debris. So we have key members that have been working on these topics for a number of years, and really is a fantastic opportunity to bring these experts together and create these global collaboration opportunities.
Yeah, well, so I have the list here of members. This is just from Wikipedia, but in terms of the international coordination you're talking about, we have space agencies from Italy, France, China, Canada, Germany, India, Japan, Korea, Russia, Ukraine, the UK, of course. NASA's there representing the US, and then the European Space Agency as well. So I think that, I mean, the work of coordinating here is pretty impressive.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really appreciated by the international community. I think it's that understanding that there is that consensus view from these space agencies on what good looks like in terms of space debris mitigation. And so when the IADC release its guidelines and we point towards certain characteristics or approaches that would reduce debris being generated and prevent the growth of debris on orbit, that a number of other space agencies look towards that as a good way to operate, essentially, and have adopted that into their own licensing regimes, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to take home with this current series of the Space Policy Show is the idea that safety is everyone's business, right? Because if that, at the end of the day, sustainability is about the operational viability of orbits and the environment. And if one bad actor messes it up, or one accident because of something that could have been prevented, then it ruins it for everyone. And it's not just the government agencies, but also, the business of space too, right? Profit making, etc. So, yeah. You guys have a big meeting coming up, though. You have an annual meeting every year. I believe this year it's in India. So, and as you mentioned, it's the 30th anniversary, which is kind of impressive. So tell us about what kinds of topics are hot this year.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. So later this month, there will be our annual meeting at the IADC. So the working groups do meet throughout the year, so virtually. So they get together to sort of understand the status of the various activities. But the annual meeting is a core activity where we bring large delegations together from all of the member agencies into one place. And so it's a week-long set of meetings where they coordinate on the activities. We have joint working group meetings, so across working groups to sort of coordinate on certain action items and our internal tasks. And that's how we sort of govern our activities. But the meeting rotates with the chair. So last year, Isa was the chair of the IADC. So Holger Krag, who's the Space Safety Program Manager, was the chair. So it was at ESOC last year. And then this year, Dr. Anil Kumar is the chair from Israel. And so we'll be joining him in Bangalore later this month.
Right. So if people want to kind of follow some of the outcomes and discussions of that, is there a place you can tell them to go?
Yes, so we do have a website. I would encourage people to log onto our website and to learn a bit more about the IADC. So it does have a lot of background about how the agency, the IADC, was started. It has an insight into our terms of reference, what the members do in terms of the work, but also what our approach is for new members to join committees. So that's all available on the website. And importantly, also our new products are released. So as you mentioned earlier, you mentioned the space debris mitigation guidelines. So that's probably our most famous product that's released from the IADC. But we also do have a number of other products that are released by the committee for the benefit of the wider community. So things such as the protection manual, which looks at shielding spacecraft. we have the status of the report on the status of the space debris environment, which I mentioned, which looks at the current and forecasted growth of space debris. And then we also have a statement on constellations. So what are the best practices and approaches that should be adopted when designing or operating constellations? So all of our new releases are on our website, but periodically there are media. So we'll probably do a comms release on what was discussed during the most recent annual meeting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you about the number of documents that you said were available on the website in terms of the guidelines and best practices. I do want to go back and ask about membership to IADC. I was reading something recently from a sister organization about the idea of introducing like observer members or associate members. Can you talk to us about that? I know that I rattled off a bunch of space agencies, but then I'm thinking about other international organizations where how industry crosses national boundaries. And so how do we pull in even more voices without diluting like the products that we're trying to put out as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things to say up front is that the key role of the IADC and the reason that it's respected in the community is that all of the members are doing active research into space debris. And that's one of the key things about the work of the working groups. They need to have members who are actually doing the modeling work or performing the measurements and can come together to develop the guidelines. So one of the key criteria about all members is that they're doing the research that can contribute to the work of the committee. But the IADC at the moment is 13 members, but we do have a process for new members to join. So at the moment, there's a process of becoming an observer where you get to see the type of work that the IADC is performing. And then there's a process by which we can understand whether the member agency can contribute towards the active work. But we recognize that debris is becoming a significant issue, and a lot of emerging space agencies and nations are interested in the work of the IADC. So we are looking at our terms of reference at the moment. So do keep an eye on our website for that update in our terms of reference, how to join. I should say in terms of delegations that join the IADC meetings, they're largely the delegations are comprised of largely government employees and academics. That's quite important to maintain that impartiality of the technical outcomes, because all of our guidelines and all of the practices that we release are based on technical evidence. So we want to ensure that they are impartial and guided by that sort of fundamental understanding of the problem, essentially, and the challenges encountered. But that doesn't mean our delegations operate in a sphere away from what's going on. A lot of the member agencies, like myself and others, are obviously working very closely with national industries. So the updates and the emerging space technologies and launch plans are folded into the work that we do to ensure that the work that's done within the IADC reflects future launch traffic and emerging trends and that are carrying within the industry.
Yeah, all that makes sense of what you're saying. It all makes sense. The work that IADC is putting out in terms of these guidelines and best practices, how does that play into like actual national rulemaking and licensing? I mean, it's does it become like soft law because they're really just guidelines, right? They're not international law. They're not treaties. How does all that play into at a national level for the UK? I know I want to ask you about that later, so you can kind of lean into that for the UK specifically, or maybe more in general for how you see it.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, the IADC isn't a regulatory body. We don't set the rules. What's released by the IADC is a consensus view on what best practice looks like in terms of debris mitigation. Now, those guidelines, so the IADC Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, have been folded into national regulatory frameworks. So there's a number of examples internationally where national regulators have looked at the IADC as what they expect when their operators provide a space debris mitigation plan, essentially. So they look at what the company is proposing, what the operator is proposing, and they check that whether they've adopted elements around the probability of success around disposal, the length of deorbit timelines, that they match what the IADC would expect in those examples. And that's really why we do a lot of work within the UK internationally. We want to share what we see as best practice, and we ensure that we share our regulatory system and our regulatory framework with others internationally, that framework in bodies such as UKSA, as you mentioned earlier.
Right. And so what do you see as the biggest challenges here for, actually, why don't, for your audience, run as you can, just give us an overview of the guidelines themselves, if you could, and then maybe mention or reflect on some of the big challenges there for getting these kinds of guidelines into national regulatory frameworks. I mean, there are a lot of smaller nations that are entering the kind of the space now. There's they might have less budget for trying to. Passing a rule is one thing, but then you have to actually enforce it and have the expertise to make sure that people applying for licenses are crossing T's and dotting I's. So give us a little rundown of the guidelines, and then maybe talk about what do you see as some challenges there.
Yeah, absolutely. So focusing on the IADC space debris mitigation guidelines, essentially there's principles which sit behind three core elements. So that's preventing explosive and collisional on-orbit collision of objects, removing
That's
objects.
a no-brainer, right?
Yeah. And so preventing breakups. There's removing objects at the end of life within a timed fashion, and then limiting debris objects released during normal operations. So, for example, around preventing explosions and collisional breakups, we look at areas such as passivation of spacecraft. So, at the end of life, propellant tanks we advise that propellant tanks are vented to avoid that stored energy, essentially, that could cause a fragmentation of the body if it was collided with, or if there was a mismanagement of the thermal system, essentially. Within that removal of objects at end of life, obviously there's areas such as the 25-year guideline, but actually, interestingly, within the IADC guidelines, it does say direct re-entry is preferred, but then the lifetime should be less than 25 years. And then we also look at the reliability of the systems. So the space debris mitigation guidelines have a number of guidelines. They identify regions of interest. So these protected regions at GEO and LEO, where we advise that these certain operational practices are adopted to limit the debris that's generated. Now, usefully, one document that's usually missed is there's actually a supporting document that sits alongside the IADC mitigation guidelines. So that supporting document gives a bit more technical evidence, a bit more insight into where these guidelines were generated and what technical evidence exists to substantiate them. Now, in the UK, maybe just reflecting a bit on how we adopt that. So within the UK, we have a spaceflight regulator, which sits with our Civil Aviation Authority. And they take on the requirements around our international obligations to authorize and supervise our national activity in space. So they have a group of engineers and policy experts and inspectors that work with operators to ensure that they're meeting our international obligations around space debris mitigation and around national security and other areas.
And those are the treaty bound. When you say international obligations for authorization and taking care of the objects that are up there, it's from the Outer Space Treaty and other international agreements.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely right. So UKSA, Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space that you mentioned previously, was established in 1959 by the General Assembly. And from some of its major work was the establishment of the Outer Space Treaties. So this body of international law, which identifies things around liability, around how you authorize and need to supervise national activities. So they count as our international obligations under which the sort of our regulator acts. Now, you mentioned about how do we work with emerging space nations and emerging operators. And that's where really UNCOPIUS is a fantastic body. So UNCOPIUS has over 100 member states that are part of the committee. As you mentioned, I head a delegation for the SDSC for the UK, but they also have another subcommittee called the Legal Subcommittee, which meets about now, sort of April timeframe in the year, and then also it has the main plenary within the middle of the year. And one of the key things for COPIUS is to share activities. So share how members are working towards peaceful use of outer space, but they also share challenges. So within one of the subcommittees, as I mentioned, the Science and Tech subcommittee, there's a working group on long-term sustainability. And this working group, over a number of years, developed the LTS guidelines, are called, so these 21 agreed guidelines. And we work to look at now within the new working group, how we implement those guidelines. So what does implementation look like? So within the guidelines, it talks about safety of space operations. What does that really tangibly mean for operators?
Right.
And through that, we report on how we adopt the IADC guidelines and other best practices to guide our operators in the UK.
And it might look different for different players, right? I mean...
Yeah, absolutely. So we recognise that different members have different capabilities, both in terms of technology, both in terms of regulatory frameworks. But that's what we do a lot of capacity building. So one of the core tenets of the working group at the moment, alongside looking at challenges and possible new guidelines and implementation, is capacity building. So it's sharing how we implement these guidelines with emerging space nations, and showing what we do to voluntarily implement the guidelines, and what they could work towards potentially in their own implementation. So it's a fantastic forum to have those conversations and share that best practice.
Yeah. Now, so the UK Space Agency is really kind of prioritizing space sustainability in general. So can you talk a little bit, kind of going a little bit narrower from your role on the international level to your role at UK Space Agency? What is the thinking there?
Yeah, so within the UK, a few years ago, we released what was known as the National Space Strategy. And this was the first time that civil and defence requirements for space came together. So it was a cross-government look, and it tried to identify, well, what capabilities and what do we want to do in the future as the UK government in space. And one of the key areas that was identified in that, one of the key priorities was sustainability, was space sustainability.
Exactly. You can't have civil or defence capabilities without an operational environment, right?
Absolutely. So it was really identified as one of the core aspects of having a thriving space economy. So in the UK, we've essentially, you can look at the Space Agency's corporate plan. So this identifies some of our key activities. But really, it's linked around both the missions. So what are the future missions, such as remediation missions, do we want to look at and fund? The technology, what is the core technology that we want to use and promote and drive to support that sustainability efforts? But then also the regulatory framework. So what are the future regulations and policy that's needed national front, but then also what work do we need to do internationally to work towards this preservation in the space environment?
Now, you mentioned the I can't remember what my scribble notes say right here, but the regulator for UK Space Agency. Is it, you have just one regulation authority?
Yes. So for your audience in the US, that might be
Right.
It's obviously slightly different to what you see in the US with a number of different regulators. But in the UK, and maybe just to highlight our role, so UK Space Agency is an executive agency of one of our central government departments. So we're very close to central government. And what we do as the agency on the regulatory front is essentially we establish the policy that our regulator adopts and implements. And the UK Space Agency does that for the orbital activities, so our spacecraft. But then the DFT, so the Department for Transport, does that for launch. And that's fed into our Civil Aviation Authority. So the same, so the CAA, who look after aircraft and civil aviation, also have a group which looks after spaceflight. And they're responsible for regulating all space activity, whether it's launch or orbital activities. Now, they do coordinate across government. So they work with environmental agencies. They work very closely with Ofcom, who obviously lead on the spectrum allocation.
Ofcom.
So Ofcom are a group within the UK who look after spectrum. So within so you have the ITU internationally, who
International Telecommunications Union, yeah.
Well, and then Ofcom do that nationally for the UK, so the national entity that coordinate those activities. But interestingly, within the UK, we just have the CAA as our spaceflight regulator. Whereas obviously in the US, you have the FAA, AST, who look after launch, and then you have various other bodies who look after specific parts of the regulatory activities in space.
So the other thing I wanted to kind of drill in a little bit more from IADC to UKSA. Now I'm the one throwing around the acronyms, all the way to the Office of Chief Engineer. So you are the Chief Engineer. What goes on in your office? What are you guys? What are your priorities?
Yeah, no, thanks. So as you say, so I'm the Chief Engineer at the UK Space Agency. I work within our senior leadership team to really drive and understand what our technical needs are. My team, the Office of the Chief Engineer, the OCE, works across all our different directorates. So we work on launch activities, we work on sustainability topics to provide that technical assurance, so to provide that oversight and understanding of the technical challenges and the risks encountered on some of our programs. We also do a lot of R&D, so we do sort of early phase studies, develop technical evidence around future policy decisions. And in that vein, we do a lot of work around sustainability, because that's one of the areas that we're heavily involved in. At the moment, we have projects looking at differential drag, so how that can be used and whether it's sufficient for spacecraft to be used to maneuver spacecraft for collision avoidance. And
using drag, you said.
Yeah, so obviously spacecraft need to be able to maneuver on orbit, or certain classes of the spacecraft need a maneuver capability. And it's really to try and understand the performance of differential drag. So how can you use the drag of the spacecraft, because there's still a bit of drag up there that you can use, and how can you orientate the spacecraft to maneuver, and whether that's sufficient and timely enough compared to maybe a propulsive maneuver, so something that's using a propulsion system on the spacecraft. So we do types of research in those type of areas that may inform future policy.
Yeah. What other? What's another? I know that you worked on Harpoons at one point for active debris removal. What are some other kind of R&D things what's something else you're excited about that might change the game
in the future? I think there's a lot going on in the space industry at the moment. I think the idea around democratization of space, so the making things smaller, faster, cheaper, is really exciting. So obviously in the UK at the moment, we're trying to establish launch and some commercial launch operations in the UK. So we've got a number of different spaceports that are developing their facilities. So that's really exciting. I think that the key thing at the moment is the space industry is rapidly changing. So we're seeing a lot more activity in space. We're seeing constellations being launched. So I think there's a lot to be excited about in the industry at the moment.
Yeah. What about some of what's a key technical challenge your office is working on? Give me an example.
So one of the areas that we're supporting at the moment is our national active debris removal missions. So we have 2 teams in the UK that are looking at developing a future national mission to remove UK objects from orbit. So the UK does have a catalogue of UK licensed objects. So that's available on the agency's website and gives a list of all the different objects that have been licensed from the UK. And we're designing these missions at the moment to go and retrieve 2 of those objects. So to launch a mission to capture an object, to bring it down to a lower altitude, and then go back up and capture another one, and then remove it at the end of the mission. And that's obviously it would be a game-changing capability to be able to demonstrate remediation and a sort of a national response to removing objects at the end of life.
Yeah. No, that's great. And it's interesting. I know that active debris removal is on the minds of many people, but in terms of the business case for it, who's going to pay for it? So UK Space Agency is choosing to prove this concept using their own money, and then hopefully that will create get rid of at least the technical challenge, and then we can worry about going forward with it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the key thing about these about the ADR missions, so the debris removal missions, is that they do demonstrate the fundamental technology for other applications. So there's a lot of discussion around in-orbit servicing and manufacture, and all of those future space missions will require rendezvous and proximity operations. They will require robotic manipulators. So an ADR mission is a good proving ground to demonstrate those technologies, maybe for those other markets, essentially.
So thanks for being. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that maybe you wanted to mention? We're kind of getting toward the end of time, so I've really enjoyed this, and I think our audience, the IADC is doing great work. The idea that all of that, all of those guidelines and best practices are really backed by that technical knowledge, and the technical knowledge is coming from such a wide array of experts from around the globe. I think that's good work. You're doing good work. So is there anything you want to mention?
No, I think it's been really great to chat to you today and have this opportunity. I think the key element is that we want to preserve the space environment for future generations. That's what we're all working towards. There's some fantastic research being done globally on this topic, and the IADC is one group that's bringing together some of that understanding of that future environment. And I think space sustainability will become even more of a core issue for future operators to be aware of. So thank you for the opportunity for promoting both the work of the IADC and within the UK at the moment.
So everyone, remember this show is part of our 6-part series on space safety through a global lens. And other shows include things like space weather, launch, space rescue. Just follow us to get notified of the shows as they come out. All of these are available on YouTube and most podcast platforms. And you can also find more of the center's in-depth research at our website, csps.aerospace.org. As always, thank you to the stupendous James Liggins, our technical director. And thanks for joining, everyone.